हमारा मदरसा अल-कुबा उसका कोई और मकसद नहीं है। मैं सिर्फ ये चाहता हूँ कि अहले सुन्नत के कुछ अफराद नौजवान तैयार हो जाएं, हमें बच्चे दें और मौलवी लें।
وهو بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Alhamdulillah, welcome back to another one of our weekly Aqidah lessons. But Alhamdulillah, we're making our way through Imam Al-Tahawi's exposition of this creed of the Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. And in the last lesson, if you recall, we spoke about the existence of Allah Ta'ala, the necessary attribute, primary attribute of Allah Ta'ala being wujud, existence. And we presented logical arguments about the existence of Allah Ta'ala. We spoke about the idea of what we termed Burhan Tamanu or Burhan Tawarud, the idea that there's a design in the world. The world isn't just something that's come about. And then also the idea of logically that if you had more than one God, then what problems that would bring about. So now that we've affirmed as a starting point that obviously Allah Ta'ala exists, and secondly we've affirmed that necessarily, wajib, by way of wujud, that God that we believe in has to be one God. Monotheism is logical. Belief in one God is logical and necessary. Belief in anything more than one God is illogical, is flawed. And we've spoken about why that is. So now we ask ourselves the question that, do we know God? Do we know who Allah is? And first, the starting point is to realize that when we speak about this idea of Allah Ta'ala, remember that Allah Ta'ala, and broadly speaking Islam, isn't just something that started with the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Islam, the concept of all of the beliefs that we have, the core usul of our religion, are something we start from the beginning of time until now, because they're a reality. So every prophet told us the same things about Allah Ta'ala. It's not that Musa alayhi salam, for example, told the Bani Israel that Allah Ta'ala has different attributes. It's not that Isa alayhi salam told his followers, the Christians, that Allah Ta'ala has different attributes. Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the previous prophets, all of the previous ummahs, all believed in the same core principles. As time went on, the different shari'ahs and different laws that came, they didn't change the usul. They didn't change the core beliefs of Islam. The core beliefs of Islam have always remained the same. It's certain rules of fiqh that have changed, for example, broadly speaking. Like as an example, for us, if your clothes get impure, then what do? We're taught the rules of how to purify our clothes. Whereas in the past, they couldn't purify clothes, they had to get rid of them. The way we do tawbah, the way we ask Allah for forgiveness is by words, by feeling bad, by doing tawbah, making promises not to do it again and so on. But in the past, the way of doing tawbah was very different. The way of doing tawbah was that if they did a sin in the night, when they woke up in the morning, it would be written on the door what sin they've done. And then they would, as the Quran speaks, that the tawbah of some of them was faqtulu anfusakum, kill yourselves. So over time, the fiqh changes, the secondary rulings change, but the usul-ud-din, these that we're speaking about now, these remain the same. If you went to the Sharia of Adam alayhi salam, you'll find this as the understanding of Allah Ta'ala. If you go to the Sharia of any of the other prophets, you'll find this as the understanding of Allah Ta'ala, and that's why in our Sharia we find that this is our understanding of Allah Ta'ala. So, in order for us to recognize Allah Ta'ala, we have to first acknowledge that we're incapable of recognizing Him truly. We have to acknowledge that we have limitations. How is it possible for us, as limited created beings, to truly and comprehensively understand the being which is infinite and uncreated, the creator? It's not possible. You can't fit the unlimited into the limited. So then somebody could say at this point, they could say, well, if the first belief of Islam is Man Rabbuka, who is your Lord, and we can't even acknowledge the true comprehension of this Lord, then why are we being held to account for belief? And the answer is very simple. The answer is very simple. We believe in that which the Quran told us and the Prophet ﷺ told us about Allah. The Quran, the Prophet ﷺ has described to us those things which we know about Allah, and likewise it explains to us those things which we can't know about Allah. Islam is to submit to those things that we can know and to submit also to those things that we can't know. For example, and this is an important point, when you come to talk about the attributes of Allah, and remember this because it's going to keep coming up. When you talk about the attributes of Allah, we affirm the attribute, but when somebody asks the question, how is this, how will that happen, how is this, and the question relates to Allah and His attributes and His actions, many times the answer will be, we believe even though we don't understand the how. We believe even though we don't understand the how. In more sort of technical terms, they say that we affirm the attribute and these other things, but we don't affirm the modality, M-O-D-A-L-I-T-Y, modality, the kayfiyya. We can't affirm that because we don't know what that is. For example, if somebody says that in the akhirah, is it possible for us to see Allah Ta'ala? And you'll see there's a chapter coming about this, ru'ya of Allah Ta'ala, seeing Allah in the akhirah. We say yes. We say yes. Somebody then asks the next question, how will we see Allah? That's the kayfiyya question. That's the modality question. That's the how question. And with that we say, we believe that we will see Him, but we don't know how. So you see that Islam taught us what we believe, but also taught us the boundaries and the limitations of what we can and can't understand and what we can and can't know. So in that regard now, what we start today is more detailed discussions around the attributes of Allah. We spoke about wujud in the last lesson, existence, and the idea that the existence is a solitary, unique existence, tawheed, the oneness of Allah. So today Imam Al-Tahawi, he continues, so we make our way into the text. Those of you that are following the book, it's page 19 of the text. Again, you know, with this book, by the way, I probably should have said this earlier, but with this book, you maybe use it as, you have two options. If you want to read a couple of sections before you come and then I speak about it, then that's one way of doing it. You get some pre-reading in. Alternatively, if you want to wait for me to go through the text, and then whatever part of the text we complete, you want to go away and see what Qadi Ghaznavi has said about it, then you can do that as well, either or. Right? But me personally, I'm just following it as the text. The Shara is just for you guys to read on your own. I'm not reading through the explanation. There might be some points which overlap, because of course we're explaining the same thing. Right? There might be some points that overlap, but I'm not reading the Shara to you. You can do that in your own time, on your own. It's not a difficult text to read, especially if you've gone through the relevant sections. So Imam Tahawi, what does he say next? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. He says, قَدِيمٌ بِلَا ابْتِدَاءٍ قَائِمٌ بِلَا انْتِهَاءٍ لَا يَفْنَى وَلَا يَبِيدُ وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ. Let's do that part first. There's a couple of points, and then inshallah we'll move along. So the first part, he says, قَدِيمٌ بِلَا ابْتِدَاءٍ or بِلَا ابْتِدَاءٍ. Allah Ta'ala is pre-eternal, qadeem, without any beginning. Without any beginning. So firstly, what does the term qadeem mean? So when we say that we describe Allah, we say that Allah is qadeem. Allah is qadeem. What does qidam or being qadeem mean? Very simple. There's two terms which we use to describe being. Either the being is qadeem or the being is hadith. Qadeem or hadith. Now please, as I say, don't get scared by the Arabic. What does qadeem mean and what does hadith mean? Qadeem means that it always existed. There was never a time that it didn't exist. It's an existence that was never preceded by non-existence. Can you all hear me? Yes, the disturbances are causing problems, is it? Okay. So it was never preceded by non-existence. There was never a point where it didn't exist. The only being that exists like that is Allah. The only being that exists with qidam, yani is qadeem, is only Allah. Nothing else exists like that. Let me translate that in a different way. There was a point for everything where it didn't exist and then it came into existence. Every single thing had a beginning to its existence. Before that beginning, it didn't exist. After that beginning, it came into existence. Everything other than Allah is hadith, and only Allah is qadim. That's our belief. So now the question is this. If everything has a beginning, and that beginning has to have been started, right? That's the nature of something beginning, it has to have been started. In order for it to have started, there had to have been one to make it start. Things don't, think about it logically, this is the logical discussion, think about it logically. When's the last time that you ever saw something come into existence just on its own? Is it possible logically for anything to bring about its own existence? Like, can I create myself? Can the water create itself? Can anything create itself? Logically, anything that has a beginning, it doesn't make sense for it to have created itself, which means that necessarily there had to be something that brought it into existence. For us as Muslims, what do we say? We say that that thing is Allah. And that's the reason why we have to affirm that Allah Ta'ala didn't have a beginning. Because if, now again just talking for the sake of discussion and learning, if we say for one moment that Allah did have a beginning, if we say for one moment that Allah did have a beginning, there was a point where He didn't exist and then He came into existence, what's the first question we ask? We say, who brought Him into existence then? Because logically we've already accepted that nothing can bring itself into existence. And that would apply to Allah then in that situation as well. So logically we have to say that the God which we believe in, the Allah which we affirm as existing, is a God that never was preceded by non-existence. He always existed. His beginning wasn't there. There was no beginning to God's existence. Because when you say that the beginning of God's existence, what you're affirming is, before that beginning there was no existence. That's why if you come back to the text, what does Imam Al-Tahawi say? He says, Qadimun, He was, Allah is pre-eternal. I know the wording of the book is eternal. I prefer to translate it more as pre-eternal, just to give that extra ma'na. Allah is pre-eternal, He existed forever and ever and ever, bila ibtida, without any beginning point. The bila ibtida is just emphasis of the meaning of being qadim. So that's the starting point. The next thing that we then look at then is, okay then, if Allah never had a beginning point, will it be then that Allah has an ending? Will it ever be the case that Allah will stop existing? I live, and then whatever, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, however long a person lives, and then you die. Everything that you see in existence exists, it lasts a period of time, and then it finishes. Is Allah like that? Why not? Laysa kamithlihi shay. That you can't understand Allah from the creation. That's the biggest mistake that people often make when they try to conceptualize God. When they try to conceptualize Allah and they try to understand Allah through the creation. They say, well, in creation I've seen this, therefore God must be like this. But the Quran has already told us, Laysa kamithlihi shay, nothing is like Him. You can't understand Allah from the creation. That's a different attribute, inshallah, which we'll talk about shortly. But for now, nothing is like Allah. Just because other things end doesn't mean that Allah will end. Allah's existence is eternal, it continues forever and ever and ever. Yani that's why Imam Al-Tahawi says in the next part of the text, Da'imun bil-intiha. Yani Allah is everlasting, He remains without an ending. Because again, remember, what do we say? We said that the existence of everything depends upon Allah. If Allah ceases to exist, everything ceases to exist. In order for something to stop existing, there has to be a cause. There has to be a cause. What stops our existence more often than not, it's the angel of death. Yeah? Yeah. I can't hear you. Allah, yeah, Allah. Good, that's a better answer. And the angel of death sent by Allah. So Allah Ta'ala is the one who causes our ends. Why is Allah able to cause our end? Because He's more powerful than us. In order to cause the end, Allah has to be more powerful than us. Tell me who is more powerful than Allah that can cause his end? Because if you affirm that Allah has been ended by something, for example, then what you're affirming is something is more powerful than Allah. And that's not our conceptualization of God, because our God is the God which can't be overcome by anything. We talked about that, remember earlier. La yu'jizuhu shay. And nothing can overpower Him, nothing can dominate Him, nothing can weaken Him. So our God is one which will not end. And the existence of everything is dependent upon Him. Now there's a question. Now what's the question? Somebody could say, if you're saying that the entirety of creation is different to Allah, so everything has a beginning, Allah didn't have a beginning. You're now saying that everything, Allah Ta'ala will never end. Well, I can show you something that also doesn't end. And this is from the Quran. What does the Quran tell us about paradise and the dwellers of paradise? Any paradise, and whenever it talks about paradise, Jannatin tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, khalidina fiha. Everywhere it talks about khalidina, khulud, forever and ever and ever. So I've just shown you how something from the creation, because paradise, hellfire, the dwellers of hellfire, paradise, the denizens of the hellfire, the people who live are doomed in the hellfire, all of them are creation. How are they eternal and Allah is eternal? What's the answer? I told you 99% of the answers are going to be Laysa kamithlihi shay. Laysa kamithlihi shay. That Allah's existence and Allah's existing forever, His existence is His own. His existence doesn't depend on anything. When we say that the paradise will remain forever, it only remains because Allah allows it to remain. When the dwellers of paradise remain forever, they only remain because Allah wills for their existence to remain forever. So Allah's existence, which is not dependent upon anyone's will, is not dependent upon anybody allowing it, is His own, is different to the eternal existence of paradise, of hellfire, of the inhabitants of both of these places. So that objection doesn't apply. But can you see the reason why I raised it was because to show you that the way to tackle these issues is come back to the core principles that we spoke about. Laysa kamithlihi shay was the answer to the objection. Laysa kamithlihi shay, nothing is like Allah. That was the response to the objection, and when we open it up, we can see how that answers the issue. So no beginning, no end. Allah existed forever, pre-eternally, and Allah exists forever afterwards as well. And to emphasize that point, He says, La yafna wa la yabid. Yani Allah, He doesn't like fana, He never ceases, doesn't get destroyed, doesn't perish, wa la yabid, and He never stops existing. He never comes to nothingness. This is just emphasizing the point, da'imun bila intiha. Allah remains without an end. So this is our conceptualization of God. One of the other things to note as well is, and it's going to say later too, but beginning and end, these are relative concepts to time. These are relative concepts to time. Time doesn't apply to Allah. Why does time not apply to Allah? Like, we're bound by time, aren't we? So I can only travel a certain distance in a certain amount of time. If I sit here for X amount of time, then, for a period of moments, a certain amount of time has passed, and so we're bound by time. We're bound by the laws of physics. Allah is not bound by the laws of physics because time, space, all of these laws, these are creation. The creation cannot bind the creator. So all of these ideas to do with time, they don't apply to Allah. Time doesn't bind Allah in any way. Allah is more dominant because time is a form of creation. So that's why anything which affirms time for Allah, for example, like in the Quran, where you see things like creation in 6 days, fi sittati ayyam, this is from the Quran, creation taking 6 days, you don't interpret that literally. Because think about it, let's systematically go through it. Imagine we interpret it literally and we say that it took 6 days. What's wrong with saying this sentence? What would that do? Anyway? Yeah. Exactly, it puts the time on Allah's actions. But we know, don't we, that time, being creation, doesn't bind Allah, doesn't apply to Allah. Allah is free from applications of time. The Mufassirun, the people who explain the Quran, they simply say that these verses are just to aid our understanding of the issue. Just to aid our understanding of what it means to create and assist us in understanding. Otherwise, time doesn't apply to Allah. Anywhere where you see in the Quran or in the Hadith or anywhere like that, then time doesn't apply because laysa kamithlihi shay, nothing is like Allah. The next point, وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ. This next point is very important because it talks about a very important topic or a very important attribute of Allah. Allah is murid. Allah is murid. What does murid mean? Murid means one who has intention, one who intends. Allah has irada. So he says, وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ. Only that which Allah wills will happen. Nothing can happen except that which Allah wills. Irada. Whatever you see happening, everything is dependent upon the will of Allah. And this is without exaggeration. Everything is dependent upon the will of Allah. Me lifting my hand, I've just lifted my hand, I couldn't have lifted it if Allah hadn't willed. Me turning my hand, everything is existent because of the will of Allah. Nothing can exist without the will of Allah. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Existence is pre-dependent upon Allah's irada. Now there's a couple of points here. That includes evil. That includes evil and sin. Even sins, when a person commits a sin, this only comes into existence because Allah's irada, Allah's will, allowed it to come into existence. We don't believe, and I understand this firmly, we don't believe that we create our own actions. As the Ahlul Sunnah, one of the key parts of our belief is that Allah creates everything. Everything is dependent upon His irada and His will. We don't create anything. But then there's another matter. If Allah's willing evil, for example, I'm saying it openly, even though when we elaborate on it a little bit, we don't say it in those words, but just for the sake of understanding, so just to elaborate on the understanding point, we just explained, don't we? We say that irada of Allah Ta'ala relates to the evil, it relates to the good. But out of adab, we don't usually say that expressly. Well, let's open it up a little bit. Why do we say that Allah irada presupposes even evil? Because as I said, everything that exists because Allah willed it. But willing something isn't the same as being pleased with it. Willing something isn't the same as being pleased with it. So what we would say is when good things come about, when a person does something good, then this involves the irada of Allah, His will, but also His pleasure. But when Allah wills, like something evil happens, then that relates to the irada of Allah, but not His pleasure. The pleasure of Allah doesn't relate to evil actions. But because for it to exist, nothing can exist without the irada of Allah coming first. Only the irada of Allah can bring things into existence. Does that make sense? Are there any questions so far? Remember I said if as soon as a question arises, please ask them. You don't want to get confused in this one. Yep. So why would Allah want evil in the world? Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very good question. And this is a problem which the atheists actually raise against us. The question is, why would Allah want evil in the world? So the way we understand that as Muslims is this. We say that, look, this world that we live in, it's darut taklif, it's a realm of test. So a person is tested with the presence of evil, a person is tested with these matters, number one. Number two, Allah has given us free will to choose. Just because everything is dependent upon the will of Allah doesn't mean that we don't have free will. We have a free will to choose what we want to do and what we don't want to do. The free will is the basis of reward and punishment. So now what happens, Allah in His infinite knowledge knows that what I and you will choose, we don't choose it because Allah knows about it, but Allah knows about it, His intention precedes it, because He knows that our free will would choose that action. So He doesn't create it to cause problems for us. Rather, because we have free will and because this is the realm of being tested, then we have a choice. And then when we make that choice, for example, of doing evil, then Allah wills it and that evil comes into existence. Is He pleased by it for us? Is His pleasure attached to it? No. That's why when we choose to do that evil action, then we're held to account for it and there's punishment for it. Make sense? Good. Any further questions on that point? Yeah.
What does irada mean?
Irada means to intend something. To intend. Good. Any other questions? Yeah.
If I was to do something evil, that's because I've chosen to do it, not because it's already written down and regulated.
No. Exactly. That's our understanding of destiny. I mean, there's a whole section on destiny, but I'll touch on it very lightly now. Our belief about destiny is that everything that happens because Allah wills it. In the sense, what do we mean by this sentence? In the sense that nothing can come into existence unless Allah has willed it. What's the idea of destiny and what we do? We all have a free choice to do what we want to do, right? We have a free will. And using that free will, we take a certain course in life. Allah in His infinite knowledge knew exactly what we would do. And that's then recorded, which we call taqdeer, that destiny, that's recorded. Now, summary of that, we don't do what we do because Allah makes us do it. Because Allah has recorded what we're going to do, that's why we're doing it. No. Rather, it was recorded because Allah knew what we would do. As an analogy, let me explain it by analogy. And it's not, obviously, there's no analogy for Allah is there because laysa kamithlihi shay'. But to understand it, imagine you have a friend, and whenever you go out, he always gets the same drink. Always, without fail. Like, what drink could it be? Preferably one on the boycott list. Right? Iron brew, for example, right? Every time you go out, they get iron brew, without fail. Whether it's cold, whether it's hot, whether they've had the dessert, doesn't matter what they've ordered, always they have iron brew. Right? And then you go out, what do you know that's going to happen? What's he going to order? Or she? Iron brew, right? Now somebody says to you, oh, he or she ordered iron brew because you had knowledge of it. So you write it down, he will order iron brew. And you say, he ordered iron brew because I wrote it down. Does that make sense? Is that what happened? Yes, no? Did that person order iron brew because you wrote it down? No. What happened? You wrote it down because in your infinite knowledge or your knowledge of this person, you knew what he was going to do. Allah is A'lam. Allah is the Alim. Allah is the one who has knowledge of everything. Right? So Allah knew exactly what would happen. It was recorded down. We don't do it because it was written. Rather, it was written because Allah in His knowledge knew what we would do. That's our understanding of destiny. Anything more than that, it gets problematic. So the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't encourage deep discussions into destiny. I mean, I know we're quite far away from destiny. I'll say this again there. But destiny isn't something that you blame for your problems. Right? I miss namaz, oh, it was written like that. Yeah, oh, I swear, it was written like that. Oh, I do this, it was written like that. That wasn't written like that. It was only written because you chose to do that. You had free will. Allah knew in His infinite knowledge what you would do, and you chose to do that. You're responsible for it. Don't shirk your responsibility for evil unto Allah Ta'ala. Allah is not at fault for your evil. You're at fault for your evil. So nobody should use destiny as a weapon to justify their evil. And this is what some of the groups of the past did. There's a group which, I don't want to get too much into it, but there's a group known as the Jabariyya. And what they said is we have no free will. Everything is forced upon us. If you have no free will, then there's no basis to be held to account. Like if I have no control over my actions, and I'm just doing what Allah is forcing me to do, and then on the day of judgment I stand before Allah and I say, look, I want you to read namaz, but you didn't let me. Why are you punishing me now for not praying? That's an objection to Allah, isn't it? Allah is just. Allah is adil, He has justice. This goes against the concept of justice. So a believer always has free will, and Allah's irada doesn't take away from the free will that a human has. And it's that free will, the choice that we make using that free will, that a person will be held to account based upon on the Day of Judgment. So it's a question, how do you know what's influencing your free will? Is it the nafs or is it the shaitan? I mean, usually both of them are pushing you towards evil. So usually when a person makes an intention to do good, that's usually themselves. And then split second later, that voice which tells you to water it down or do something evil, that's usually the nafs of the shaitan, the voice that you're supposed to be ignoring. Okay. So the next piece of text, he says, لا تبلغه الأوهام ولا تدركه الأفهام, something which we touched upon earlier. So the text means that imagining and imagination, awham, plural of the word wahm, imagination. Imaginations can't comprehend Allah. And لا تدركه الأفهام, and understanding can't grasp Allah. So let's think about these 2 points. They're ultimately saying the same thing, but what does the first point mean? Imaginations can't comprehend Allah. Why? Because as if you remember when we did the first lesson, Mawlana Zain, mashallah, he put this point to us quite well when he talked about the idea that when you imagine something, imagine the nicest version of it. You think of a house, imagine the nicest version of a house. You think of a place, imagine the nicest version of it, whatever, right? All you're doing is you're pulling through things which you already know and then exaggerating them. So you might you think of a nice car, the fastest car you can think of. Yeah, but you already had the impression of a car in your mind. The nicest house, yes, but you already had an impression in your mind. Is Allah something that can be comprehended in the mind? No. So how can you imagine Allah when Allah is something that can't be imagined? Nothing is capable of imagining Allah. Let me put it to you in a different way. Are you able to imagine paradise? Are you able to imagine paradise? Gee? What you're imagining is wrong. That's not paradise. That's what you think paradise is. But you're not imagining what actual paradise is. So when you can't even imagine paradise, which is basically just a creation of Allah, how do you think that you can imagine Allah, the one who created paradise? Allah is not capable of being comprehended in the mind. That's why, and this is an important principle, the ulama of Aqidah and Tasawwuf and other points as well, they mention things. They say that whatever you imagine Allah to be, Allah is other than that. Whatever you imagine Allah to be, Allah is other than that. So if you imagine, the minute you start thinking Allah is like this, and you get this image in your mind, realize that Allah is other than that. Because that image which you pulled through, that image has been pulled through from some form of creation. Now this brings us to a very, very important principle in understanding the sifat of Allah. It's known as mukhalafa lil hawadith. Mukhalafa lil hawadith. Mukhalafa means to be different. Hawadith is plural of the word hadith. In simple terms, Allah is different to the creation. Absolutely different to the creation. Whatever you imagine has a similarity to creation. Allah is different to that. Mukhalafa lil hawadith. Yeah, good. So what does it mean to have the ma'rifah of Allah? What does it mean to know Allah? What it means is to have this deeper relationship with Allah. Knowing Allah in the sense that you have this deeper, closer relationship with Allah. That you have this understanding of Allah Ta'ala which the general masses don't have. What does that come from? Because remember, there's elements of this which are like through spirituality and spiritual openings. The closer a person is to the religion, the closer a person is to the deen, the person closer is to the people of Allah, Allah will give that person spiritual openings through which the person can then recognize Allah in a better way. That's all that means. Does it mean that they've comprehended Allah? No. Why? Because Allah can't be comprehended in the imagination. Mukhalafa lil hawadith. Difference to the creation. Absolute difference to the creation. No. Any other questions? Yes.
How like us, as we talked before that, where Allah said, how can we explain that through religion? Says the orders that Allah is with you. How can we interpret that?
So again, the question is, just for those who didn't hear, there's a verse of the Quran which says, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. Yeah, Allah is with you wherever you are. That's how we translate that verse. Does this mean that Allah is physically with us? We'll work through it. Like, how would you deal with this verse based on what we know of Aqidah? Because you know enough now. Because you know Laysa Kamithlihi Shay'un, that's for everything. Right? So let's work through it. Is Allah physically with us? Why not? Because physicality is the attribute of creation. Having this physicalness, this is a creation, right? So Allah can't physically, is not physically with us in that ma'na that we attribute to creation. So that means that when you can't interpret these verses literally, you have to interpret them in a way which fits with our understanding of Allah. So then we would interpret that, for example, the ma'iyya of Allah, the withness, if you would. It's not a real word, that withness. Words I like to make up, right? Being with you, this ma'iyya that Allah has, this is interpreted by Allah's madad, Allah's help is with you. Allah knows what you're doing, His assistance is with you, He's there for you if you need to call to Him. His assistance and His help. So that's how we would interpret these types of verses. You wouldn't interpret them physically. So usually the starting point is, can you interpret it literally? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, then you have to have a justification to move away from the literal interpretation. If the answer is no, then why not? And usually with the verses relating to Allah Ta'ala, the answer is because the literal interpretation would mean that it's creating a similarity with the creation. And that applies across the board now. As I mentioned the verse of وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ, yani Allah is with you. Let's look at other verses. For example, we see a verse which mentions in Surah Al-Fatih, where it says, يَدُ اللَّهِ فَوْقَ أَيْدِيهِمْ. Now let's interpret this verse. So let's look at this verse. What does the verse literally mean? Yadullah means, yad in the Arabic language means what? Hand. So if we say, Yadullah فَوْقَ أَيْدِيهِمْ, that the hand literally, the hand of Allah is over their hands. Number one, are we allowed to interpret this literally in the ma'na that we have as hand? Yes or no? No. Why not? Exactly. Because if you interpret this verse literally, then what does it necessitate? It makes it necessary now that you've interpreted this verse in a way that created similarity between Allah and the creation. And what do we already know is from our studies of Imam Al-Tahawi's work, you're not allowed to create any similarity between Allah and the creation. So now this verse has to be interpreted. This verse has to be interpreted. And there are rules for interpreting it. You can't just interpret it how you feel. You can't just interpret it how you feel. For example, you have to interpret it based upon the rules of Arabic language and based upon the rules of the way the Arabic language has been used. Let me just give you an example. So in English this works quite well. I actually saw a video, I'll share it on the group inshallah. I saw a video very recent, somebody shared it. I actually asked him to send it to me specifically when this question arose. But it arose a lot quicker than I thought it would. Right? In English, when I say to you, give me a hand, give me a hand, how many people would chop off their hand and say, here you go? Anyone? I asked you to give me a hand. What does it mean in English when you say give me a hand? Help me. So how did you understand that? We interpreted the word hand based on the usage in the English language. The Quran was revealed in Arabic. Like these like metaphors and similes and similitudes that the Quran gives are to be understood in the way the Arabs understood them and the people of the language. When anybody turns around in English and says, he asked you to give him a hand and you started helping him put the drawer together, you crazy guy, why do you not chop your hand off? People are going to say, you're an idiot, you don't understand how English works. That's exactly the same thing that we say to those people who say Allah has a hand, because look, the Quran says Yadullah. No, you fool, you don't understand how the Quran works. You know nothing about Allah, you know nothing about the Quran. There's a term that we give to such people. The people who affirm a body for Allah And if you call them the mujassima, in English is a very long word which I always try to pronounce but never can. Anthropomorphism. That's a good enough Bashar. It basically means those people who affirm a body for Allah. Allah has a hand because it says Yadullah. Allah has a shin because it says Saq. Allah has a face because it says Wajh. What are all of these people doing? They're interpreting literally the Arabic language and giving the ma'na which creates a similarity with creation. Can you say that Allah has a face? Same reasoning. Because to say Allah has a face creates similarity with the creation, this is not allowed. You interpret it based upon the authority, based upon the way the Arabs interpret it. So nothing will remain except the wajh of Allah, yani only Allah will remain. Yadullahi fawqa aydihim, the hand of Allah was over their hand. No, Allah's authority was over their agreement. Bayatul Ridwan. Allah's authority, the hand of Allah, and the authority of Allah, the assistance of Allah. And so on and so forth, the way the rest of these verses are. We call these verses the mutashabih verses. Verses which we as individuals, we can't understand. So we interpret them in this way. I'll give you more details about this afterwards, inshallah, as we go. إذا تكرر this is repeated, it becomes stronger. We'll talk about it further, inshallah.
You know, another way to interpret it, could you interpret them as saying Allah has a heart in a way that befits him, for it's nothing like ours, so affirming it, not giving it a meaning?
Yeah, so there's two ways. We're going to talk about it later, but I'll talk about it now. So there's two ways of dealing with these type of verses. One is that you call, and I'm going to say the Arabic, but please don't get scared by the Arabic. I don't want anyone to get overloaded by the Arabic. One is called ta'wil. What does it mean? You interpret it. So what we did just then about Yadullah and about authority and about wajh and so on, that was ta'wil. To interpret the verse in a way which fits with the verse of the Quran, but also understanding the ma'na of the Quran. The other option is to do what we call tafweed. What does tafweed mean? Tafweed means to assign the meaning to Allah. It means we believe in it even though we don't know what it means. We leave the ma'na of that to Allah. What time is Isha? Does anyone know? 8:30. Okay. So we've got about 12 minutes. So any other questions? Yeah, so when you imagine Allah, all you're really throwing together is things that are already present in your mind. So you imagine, for example, the most beautiful of gardens. All you're going to imagine is every nice garden you've seen, the best thing that you saw in every garden, you bring it together and that's your best garden. But you could only do that with knowledge that you already had. You can't imagine things that aren't already there. Right? Imagine, like they give an example, they say, make the weirdest of animals. You're going to throw together what? The lion's head, the giraffe's neck, the zebra's legs, whatever. But all you're putting together is things that you already know. With Allah, you don't know anything of Allah that you've already grasped. You can't put anything together to create this understanding of Allah in your imagination. Okay, so I sort of lost track of time there a little bit. So, inshallah, we've reached the question of La yushbihul anam. I'm going to deal with that sentence in one line. La yushbihul anam means what? That nothing of the creation resembles Allah. That's another way of saying what? So inshallah in the next lesson, next week, we'll be starting from the next piece of text, which is وَهُوَ حَيٌّ لَا يَمُوتُ, which is the next attribute of Allah. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, so just before we finish, I'll just make a very quick request, and it is a very quick request. So many of you will know that I, as well as many of the students who have sometimes taught the classes and sometimes assisted in the classes, we all studied with a teacher called Mawlana Muhammad Ayyub Naqshbandi Rahmatullah alayhi. Many of you will know that. If you don't, then now you know. There's people here who are sat in the group which are students of theirs. They passed away sort of 21st of October, the middle night. So this coming week, so inshallah it's going to be like 6 years. They passed away in 2018. End of this week is going to be 6 years since they passed away. And obviously the only reason, and this is not without exaggeration, the only reason that we're able to sit together like this is because they taught me and we're able to sit together. If it wasn't for them, then I would not be able to sit here and read a single word of this to you. So we're indebted to them. So the request is that just this week, if you can remember them, especially in your du'as, read whatever you can and send it al-Aswab, even if it's just a Fatiha for them. and inshallah we'll probably mention it again next week, inshallah. That was just a kind request. So we are finished, so Jazakallah for everyone's attendance. Namaz is literally in like 10 minutes. Please don't go. Like, namaz is the core of our religion. Just stay for namaz with this side and this side. Please stay, please pray, and then as soon as you finish, you're free to go. But please do stay for namaz. Don't leave before namaz. Jazakallah.